Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of This Is Your Captain speaking. Today, I'm super excited to have somebody on that's all about podcasts. I've got Jason Bradwell as the founder of B2B Better. Just a bit of background on Jason. Jason has been working across multiple different companies over the past years, but has been in the marketing space, focused on, for example, it was a marketing and online strategist at Vodka, a marketing manager at Muck Off Limited, which is an interesting name for a company, and also director of product marketing communications at Massive Interactive, as well as senior director group marketing communications at Deltatra. So very nice to have you on, Jason.
Yeah, real pleasure to be here. Some of those companies and job titles are from a long time ago, so it's nice to be reminded.
Tell us a little bit about it. So you founded Better 2.5 years ago, almost.
Mhm.
So tell us a little bit about B2B Better and what you guys do.
Yeah, sure. So as you mentioned, prior to starting up the agency B2B Better, I was running marketing for predominantly global tech service and solution-based companies in the online media sector. And, when it comes to online broadcast media, broadcast production, it's pretty legacy as an industry in terms of its kind of go to market and how vendors go out there and win new business from the likes of BBC, Olympics, NFL, these kind of like large media rights owners and rights holders. Its marketing is predominantly based on trade shows, trade media, and relationships with sales. The sales team have with prospective clients, and having worked in that industry for you know 8 years, let's say, I always felt like there was a better way of doing things and a better way of like making our budgets, our marketing budgets work for us rather than just pumping it all into trade shows and trade media. And, this was by investing in content and investing in thought leadership content specifically, because when you sell services and when you sell solutions, really what you're selling is a commodity. There are some exceptions, but largely, that is the case. And when you're selling a commodity, your biggest differentiator is your perspective, right? Your perspective on how you can solve this problem better, quicker, cheaper than any of the hundreds of other competitors that are doing the same thing as you. And what's the best way of sharing our perspective? It's by investing in thought leadership. And who are the best thought leaders? It's the people within our business. It's the people within our organization who are on the front line solving these challenges. And so, whilst working for Delta Tray, we launched a podcast series that complemented our kind of earned and paid media strategies. And it did phenomenally well. And at the same time, I was starting my own podcast, B2B Better, and just all these points converged into a place where it made sense for me to go out there and help other B2B tech companies launch their own shows as a means of differentiating, as a means of growing brand awareness, and ultimately as a means of, winning new business opportunities. And so that's what we do now. We're a podcast marketing agency.
Okay, let's dig into the podcasting piece then. So you don't need to sell me on the benefits of a podcast, but let's dig into that a little bit. And I'd like to understand your point of view because there's a lot of podcasts out there, right? There's a lot of everybody and their dog are currently doing podcasts. It feels like, right? It was fairly niche a couple of years back, but now it's really exploded over the past maybe 3 to 4 years. In the B2B space, this typically moves a little bit slower, right? But a lot of B2B brands are now catching on and also starting their own podcast. So, like, even with a saturated market, let's say it's semi-saturated when it comes to B2B, what are the benefits that you've seen with your clients by them actually going and starting a podcast?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And what it stems from is a understanding of outcomes and what are the outcomes that you're looking to drive with your podcast. Is a podcast for everybody? Absolutely not. There are a lot of companies out there that are doing podcasts that probably should be investing their marketing dollars in other channels. There are a lot of companies out there that are investing in marketing channels that probably should be looking at podcasts. It all comes back to outcomes. What are we trying to achieve here? And that is a question that at face value sounds obvious, right? But actually, a lot of the brands that we speak to haven't had that conversation by the time they're coming to us. They know they want to launch a podcast, but usually the first question is something like, "Hey, what microphone should I buy? How often should I be publishing this podcast? What kind of length should it be?" Those are dumb questions to be asking as the first questions on whether I should launch a podcast. It's what outcome am I trying to drive? If you are trying to win new business opportunities and you have a long-term view on the value a podcast can drive, then yeah, there are ways that you can leverage a podcast with time and budget and bandwidth to drive new leads, new inbound inquiries. If you're using it to augment an account-based marketing strategy, it can be definitely used in that way in the shorter term. If it's a question of we have executives that don't have profiles and we're looking to kind of grow their exposure in our industry, of course, a podcast can do all of that. So, event activation is another one that I don't see a lot of companies thinking about. We're investing money in trade shows. How, as a marketing team, can we be generating more ROI off the back of those? We could use it as a content creation opportunity. Where else are you going to have such a concentration of potential podcast guests in one location that's going to fuel your content pipeline for the next 3 to 6 months? These are all outcomes that they probably exist in businesses everywhere, but actually having that conversation and deciding, okay, what's the strategy we're going to develop to leverage a podcast against achieving those outcomes has got to be the place that you start, because that only in doing that are you going to be able to facilitate longevity. Like, what are we trying to achieve? What's the strategy to achieve that? And do we have the budget, time, resources to see that strategy through to fruition?
Fair. Okay. So looking at it at a broader, like some of the things you mentioned there, okay, like clear. Yeah. If you want to, for example, get exposure for your senior leadership team and they don't have much of a network, or they don't have much of, they don't have much reach, and you want to get them in front of more people, it makes sense, etc. But from a pure branding play perspective, I think it also makes sense as well. And especially what I've found is if you're leaning on interesting people that also have a broader reach than what you do as a brand as well, that's also something that will help you like gain some legs as well as an organization, right? Or to get the brand out there. But like one of the things that I've found is, especially when speaking with other organizations that also run a B2B podcast, because clearly this is what we're doing here, right? Is like trying to keep up the consistency of it or keeping them going. Because like it's not one of those things where you're going to see immediate success, right? What's the advice that you're giving to your customers or the brands that you work with? Like, what's the cadence? Like, how often do we need to be doing this until we start finding our groove, until we start seeing somewhat of results? Is there even any advice you can give there?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think it comes back to what I said a moment ago, which is define what success looks like. If you're going into this exercise, or your leadership team are going into this exercise expecting hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of downloads in week one, well, is that realistic, as an outcome to be trying to drive? Do we already have a really well-established audience that this podcast is just going to be another channel in which we're going to try and activate them? Okay, maybe we have a shot of getting those big numbers. But if we have no brand awareness or no brand presence at the moment, and this is what we're trying to use to achieve that, then obviously it is not a realistic success criteria to be measuring. So yeah, it comes back to defining what success looks like. We like to think in terms of metrics. There's reach metrics and resonance metrics. So reach metrics are your metrics around like number of downloads, number of impressions, number of views, like how far and wide is the show being distributed. Your resonance metrics is the stickiness thing, right? So it's, what's the average consumption of this podcast? Like how much of it are people actually listening to? What kind of qualitative indicators of success can we look to? Comments, shares, DMs, people mentioning the podcast and sales transcripts. Like what is demonstrating to us like that stickiness factor? And of the two, you see a lot of people wanting to start with the reach metrics because it's easier to track and it's like vanity to an extent. We want those big Joe Rogan numbers, but the resonance metrics are far more important in my view in the early days, because if we're getting only 100 downloads of our podcast, but the interview or the podcast is being consumed 75% plus on average, great. Like we've got some strong stickiness there. Like we've got some good resonance. People care about what it is that we're trying to say because they're listening to the vast majority of it, right? If we're getting 100 downloads and they're only listening to, or if we're only getting if we're getting 10,000 downloads but they're only listening to 10% of the podcast, is that actually worth it? Like, sure, people maybe know who we are, but are they actually consuming the content in the way that we want them to consume it? Prioritize resonance, fix that first before looking to reach. I'd much rather have a reach problem than a resonance problem in the early days.
Yeah, fair. That makes good sense. When we're talking about benchmarks then for what good looks like, because a lot of companies or a lot of people won't know. So you just mentioned there 10% versus 75% of somebody watching somebody listening, watching whatever the podcast, what would be a good benchmark to go off of?
Yeah,
Is the
great.
75% like is 75% where you should be aiming? I mean, you should be aiming for as high as possible, but what's acceptable?
You know, I when we're starting out with working with clients, often there aren't any benchmarks, you know, for us to be measuring ourselves against in this channel for this company. And when you are starting out a new podcast program, you know, you're going into it with a hypothesis of we want to achieve this outcome. We've developed this strategy to achieve it with a podcast. We need to spend some time developing our own set of benchmarks, like, you know, what is realistic for us to achieve. And with that in mind, you know, 75% average consumption rate is a good place to start. If you can get to a point where 3/4 of your content is being consumed on average, that's a good place to shoot for. Run a program for 6 months and see if you fall under, over, somewhere in the middle, and then you can adjust strategy accordingly. Maybe we set our expectations too low and we need to ramp it up, aim for 85%, 90%. Maybe we came in way too high and we need to adjust accordingly. And like, why has that happened? You know, is it us? Is it the content? Or is it just a matter of like the audience? So 75% is a good kind of average consumption rate to be shooting for from the off. When it comes to reach, you know, it's going to really depend on so many different factors, like what industry are you operating in? Who is your target audience? Who are you as a brand? I can just reel off some numbers. To be in the top 25% of podcasts globally, if you are getting 120 downloads within the first 7 days of publishing, that's where you're going to sit, the top 25%. To be in the top 10%, it's 480 downloads. So, you know, if you have to pick some benchmarks, and you should, to just aim for in the first season of your podcast, shoot for 75%, shoot for top 10%, 480 downloads. It's not that hard to get there really with the right distribution strategy, and then come back at the end of the season, reassess, adjust, and move forward.
Interesting. Let's talk about distribution strategy because you just mentioned it there. Let's dig into that a little bit. So, what are you recommending to your customers in terms of how they distribute? What's your playbook there?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I really have a playbook because, you know, again, it comes back to outcomes, right? And there is no one size fits all approach to podcast distribution, or indeed, I feel like any kind of marketing. There are definitely guiding principles and, you know, best practices to employ, but I would hate for someone listening to this to feel like, okay, if I just do these three things, my podcast is going to be a blockbuster success, because it just won't. What works for one company won't necessarily work for another. And so working with like a strategic partner like B2B Better, who can kind of come with that marketing mindset around outcomes, strategy, distribution, and how do those all connect into one another, can be helpful for companies who maybe don't have that capacity internally. But, you know, just a couple of like key things to think about when it comes to distribution that will apply to almost all podcasts. Show notes are incredibly important when it comes to organic discovery within the podcast directories themselves. You know, treat your show notes much like you would treat a blog and trying to rank in Google. Optimize for keywords, include transcripts, you know, actually give it the time and attention it deserves rather than just leaving it as a kind of afterthought. Guests, you know, if you are inviting guests onto your podcast, you're doing like an interview-based series, to your point earlier, Andy, like they are going to be an incredibly important channel to expose your show to their audience. And so make it as easy as possible for them to share it. And I don't just mean like let them know when the podcast goes live. I mean, give them a pack, right? A pack that includes promotional assets. It includes instructions around when to post, how to post, who to tag. Just minimize as much of that friction as possible. And also make the offer, you know, that if anything you provided doesn't cut the mustard, or they want it in a different, you know, they want a different clip than the ones you've provided, you can cut that up for them, right? It would be a tragedy if someone, you got a really high profile guest on that could really open up new doors for new audiences on your show, and they simply didn't post the clips you provided because they didn't like them, right? But they liked other moments. So yeah, you got to remember when it comes to podcast distribution, there's only so far you can go in the directories themselves, and that's what makes podcasting a bit different to other channels. Like, you need to invest time and attention on repurposing the podcast content across platforms like YouTube and YouTube Shorts, LinkedIn, TikTok, Instagram, wherever you know that your audience is spending time. Make sure that you're taking this wonderful asset you spent a lot of time slaving over to get it to where it is, and you're really squeezing the juice in terms of like value creation across all of these different channels. Because if you're just publishing it into the podcast directories and hoping that people find it, even if you are spending a good amount of time and effort on the show notes, it's only going to go so far.
Fair. That's all very good advice. Thank you for that. One of the things, to go back to defining success, right? I like the way that you look at things. You need to define the outcomes, or the desired outcomes of creating a podcast. Makes sense, right? Most companies that I would work with would be in the B2B SaaS space, right? So tech space, right? And most of those organizations have an issue around lead generation. It always boils down to, like, we need more leads, right? And the expectation there, I think, is always very difficult to manage when it comes to creating podcasts. Because on a podcast perspective, my view on the world is that if you manage to bring interesting people on that have their own network, as we spoke about before, that helps to help your brand travel further, right? And with that brand traveling further, that then drives demand. But it's very hard to track that. And I've had CEOs say to me before, I'd like to do a podcast, but we need to track all the leads that we're getting from a podcast. I'm like, that's just not possible, right? And one of the things as well is what I've seen recently is more and more technologies becoming available to track the success of podcasts, or track, like, in terms of business metrics. Because again, I think a lot of businesses, especially in the B2B space, are still very much focused on, if I put €1 or $1 or £1 into this channel, what's it going to deliver directly from that specific channel? And I've seen companies such as Casted, for example. I don't know if you're familiar with Casted. They've tried to put in some metrics there to be able to see, okay, what's the business impact that it's having? But, like, when you're speaking with your customers, are they understanding of the fact that you're not, like, it's very hard to track the direct business impact that you're having? Okay, exposure for C-levels, but again, that might not be enough for them to grasp a hold of. They still want to see, how does that then go down further down the line and affect revenue? That's always what it's boiling down to normally when I have those conversations with senior leadership. They're like, okay, how is it impacting my pipeline generation or revenue generation, whatever?
Mm-hmm.
What are your
Yeah.
thoughts?
Yeah, it's a really tough nut to crack, and it requires
Mm-hmm.
like time. And I mean, there are some obvious answers, which I'm sure everyone listening to this podcast will have heard of, will be familiar with. This self-reported attribution. Can we implement a field on our forms on the website? How did you hear about us? You can select podcast, and okay, there is a way for us to be able to attribute the number of leads that are coming in as a result of the podcast. It's obviously flawed. When you get people ticking the podcast field, is that just the last place that they heard of you before they then reached out? Is it the first place? Is it one of the places? You just don't know. Is there some sort of bias there? So you have to kind of take that with a grain of salt. One of the most effective ways that we've seen podcasts being able to be leveraged against commercial outcomes is when they are coordinated in collaboration with sales teams as part of an account-based marketing strategy. And so, this could be as simple as, inviting prospective clients onto the podcast as guests. Can be effective if done in the right way. I hear horror stories all the time of CEOs and sales leaders who launch a podcast as essentially a Trojan horse to get potential customers onto the phone so they can pitch them. And that's a horrible experience for everybody. It's a horrible experience for the guest slash customer. It's a horrible experience for the audience to hear someone being pitched in real time. Don't do that. But doing it in a strategic way, where maybe we're selling into enterprise accounts and we want to, begin or nurture a relationship, and we need another touch point, another tool in order to do that. other than just a email from salesperson A, hey, can we grab a coffee? It's been a while. A podcast can be an effective tool in that regard. So that's one way of looking at it as part of an account-based marketing strategy. The other way is, as marketing leaders, we have I believe marketing exists to enable sales, because in the majority of the companies that we work with, marketing is an enablement function. We're talking about big enterprise service and solution-based businesses. Marketing is not going to publish a blog post and then customers going to come in and say, hey, here's $10 million, right? It's an enablement function. It's how can we equip sales to be more effective in their prospecting and their conversion of new opportunities. And a podcast can be a great way of doing that, because if we can enable our sales team to be more effective in their prospecting by repurposing the content that we're creating in the podcast as the fuel for those prospecting efforts, then we can prove our commercial value. So what I mean by that in real practical terms is our target customer are CTOs of FTSE 500 companies, right? And so we interview a CTO from a FTSE 500 company about all of the challenges that they're experiencing across digital transformation, let's say. We can then take that content and repackage it for our sales team to be using to reach out to the other 499 FTSE 500 CTOs, where we're saying, hey, we spoke to Joe Bloggs over here. He talked about a lot of challenges, or she talked about a lot of challenges that we're sure you're experiencing as well. Is there a conversation to be had? Or do you want to come onto the show and share your perspective on these problems? Or is there some other way that we can nurture this relationship? And so there's kind of two sides of the coin there. So yeah, if you are a company that sells into enterprise, you have, or you're thinking about running an account-based marketing program, the podcast can be a great way of enabling that program, and also bringing closer alignment between sales and marketing. And that's really important, when it comes to validation, commercial validation, because if marketing are going into a room and saying, I've been working with sales for the last 6 months on this program together, and they're getting a lot of value out of it because they're seeing higher conversion rates in their outreach, they're establishing new relationships with customers that otherwise we were struggling to get over the line. That's a really powerful argument to kind of go into a boardroom with and defend your budget against.
That's amazing advice. I really like the account-based piece, and it's actually something that I've done personally at a couple of different companies, and it works very, very nicely. And even if you're working with, for example, an SDR team or sales team, as you mentioned, it helps them get the foot in the door. That's something that's, if you recognize, you're sort of as well playing off people's egos a little bit, because I would get the seller to go after the prospects. If we've recognized you as being amazing in your field, we'd love to have you come on and have a chat with us on a podcast, because we recognize people that are amazing in their fields, just as an example. Exactly. And to them, they're like, oh, okay. I'll absolutely come on and have a chat. And that just sort of starts the conversation. Even this podcast, I think we've had a couple of guests on that would have been approached in that respect, and now they're closer to the business, right? Mm-hmm. But hey, look, we're at the end of time now, Jason. Tell us, where can people find you and where can people find B2B Better?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can learn more about the B2B Better agency at www.b2b-better.com. You can follow me on LinkedIn, Jason Bradwell. I've got the bright yellow profile photo. And of course, you can listen to the B2B Better podcast. Just search for B2B in any of your podcast directories of choice, and you will find it.
Lovely. Jason, thanks so much for coming on. It's been great speaking with you.
Yeah, real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks a million. Guys, this has been another episode of This Is Your Captain Speaking. Tune in again next week for more great content. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you.